Hi, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is 10 o'clock now, and I think we should start. I do believe that some other guest delegates will join us as we go on with the program. Welcome to the webinar 3 for just urban transition. This is the costs and trades-off for free basic electricity. My name is Silas Manazi. I will be facilitating the session together with Lauren Hermanas. Yeah, welcome to the session. It's good to have you with us this morning, and I believe you are going to enjoy the webinar insofar as the costs and trades-off for free basic electricity access is concerned. What we're gonna do is that I'm gonna take you through some basic rules that I believe we are all familiar with, which basically include the fact that let's mute our microphones during the course of the webinar. And we also recommended that we do the same on the video. Only when we are speaking, we can then unmute and mute afterwards. And we can use the chat box to ask questions during the course of the webinar. And apart from putting question on the chat box, you can also virtually raise your hand to indicate that you would like to speak or to comment or to ask question, and the facilitator will then invite you to speak, in which case you will have to then drop your hands and unmute, speak, and mute afterwards. In a situation where you would like to submit additional question or feedback or comment that could not be addressed in the webinar, please use the any of those two email addresses to ask such question or comment or feedback after the webinar. This is the program which we have on item number 1. However, I also want to highlight that ideally, we as the facilitators would have liked to you to introduce yourself, name, organization, position one by one. But due to the number of delegates, we are afraid that that may take long. Then we then request you to put your name as well as organization and email address on the chat box so that we can be able to send you the presentations after the webinar. Without any further overdue, I will hand it over to, or before I hand it over to Hermanas, just to remind you that this is the webinar, the third webinar, as I said, will focus on the costs and trades-off for free basic electricity. It's a third one. We had the first one on 23rd of October that was focusing on the informed decision-making for SSEG integration in municipalities. And the second webinar took place on the 17th of November, which was the impact on SSEG on the municipal revenue and tariff setting. So today we're on the third webinar. I'm gonna hand over to Lauren to introduce the next speaker. Thank you. Over to you, Lauren.
Great, thank you so much, Silas. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We're very lucky this morning to delve into the issue of free basic electricity. Thrilled to have as part of this webinar in particular, but also as part of a much broader collaboration, WWF South Africa, which has been conducting research in partnership with the IISD and the City of Cape Town to really think about some of the complexities and trade-offs involved in both raising the level of access under the free basic electricity allocation, as well as exploring the deployment of alternative technologies to do this. So I'm not going to hog the stage for very long, just to say that we're going to start with a little bit of an overview of this particular partnership from Louise Scholz. Then we will hand it over to the City of Cape Town to delve into the particular nature and character of the problem around free basic electricity for the city, which obviously has broad relevance for municipalities throughout the country. And then we will hand over to the IISD team to talk us through the particular modeling exercise and the broader relevance and application and conditions for usefulness for modeling as well. We will then, as Silas has indicated, go over to a Q&A session. And please, I would really encourage everybody, if there is not space or you don't feel like you want to address a particular question during this session, please do share your questions with us, either in the chats or via email. And our plan is at the end of this session, as we've done for the other webinars, to produce just a summary note with some of the key insights, as well as additional resources, and then to address everybody's questions in that note as well. So yeah, I will now hand over to Louise.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. Wait, let me just start my video. Louise Scars from WWF. I'm the Urban Futures Program Manager. I'm also not going to be long. I think we have two excellent presentations waiting for us, both from the City of Cape Town and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. This work is part of a larger body of work that we're doing, funded by the WWF Netbank Green Trust. And the intention of this work is to support municipalities to manage the increasingly complex distribution system that they're working in, with increased investment by prosumers, downward pressures on their revenue flows due to a variety of reasons. And I think everyone here on the call would agree that the challenges around the free basic allocations to poor households, the challenges around ensuring energy access to these households are pivotal and critical to all the municipalities. So having said all that, I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm going to hand over to Adrian. And I think, Adrian, you want me to share my screen for your presentation. Am I correct?
Yeah, Louise, sorry, I can't show slides. I can't put Zoom clients on my city computer. So that means I have to access through phone in this case. So if you could, I'll be very, very grateful. Thank you.
Can you see my screen or not yet?
I can still see you, Louise, but not your screen yet.
Let's just go down. Share screen.
Great, it says you've started, so I think it's just taking a second. Okay, there it is.
Cool. Thanks very much, Louise. Yeah, I'm going to give a bit of background to some of the work that's been done around low-income energy services at the City of Cape Town. Also on the call is Brian Jones, who's leading that work now. I'm talking to this mainly because a sort of funded study, if you could switch slides, please, Louise, was completed last year, led by One World and in a consortium funded by AFD. We're very grateful for their help, and much of their work and also PDG consulting is what I'll be presenting today. And yeah, the aim is just to give a little bit of context in our city situation. I mean, I heard the main topic being around FPE. I'm going to talk to the broader subsidies that we undertake in the City of Cape Town. So we supplement FPE and some of what we've discovered by looking into energy poverty and customers that have been connected. So next slide, please, Louise. So I'm just going to start by giving an idea of income. I think it's important to understand income in the context of affordability. It's not a pretty sight. We can infer what's happening with income by looking at GDP per capita. Income's a pretty steady proportion of that. And we see since the last census in 2011, really our economy stagnated in terms of the amount of wealth we generate per person and therefore income. And it's sort of on a downward trend, which means that our structure of our household wealth probably very much the same, and that's around nearly half our households earning to having a total income, household income of under 5,000 Rand a month. And if we put that less politely, that means about 24% of the City of Cape Town households are below the international poverty threshold of $1.9 a day. Next slide, please. And so some time ago, around 2008, the City of Cape Town started subsidizing FBE. And you can see that combined with FBE and the subsidized tariff, that's managed to some degree dampen the very, very severe Eskom tariff rises, which have taken electricity up more than double since then. And the subsidized regime has cut that to about 50% more. And you see lately we've even managed to bring that down slightly, but still quite a significant increase. And that means that in real terms, incomes haven't increased, especially in that low income cohort that I've shown, but we see that commodities, especially electricity, even subsidized electricity, is quite a bit more expensive. Next slide, please. Sorry, Louise, did you hear me there?
Yeah, I can see it, Adrian. So Adrian?
Can you hear me, Louise?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay, I'll carry on.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, so around 24% of that corresponds pretty well to that people under the international poverty line are on the lifeline tariff. Some of these people are getting 60 kilowatt hours of FBE and some 25 kilowatt hours of FBE, and there's a kind of means test around property values and historical consumption. And obviously there are a whole lot of special cases and there are annual road shows recruiting people to FBE and various mechanisms by which we put people on FBE. And there's been a long process of rationalizing this to keep it under control, because many people were on FBE that shouldn't have been on FBE. So there's a big administrative problem, and we're more or less just hitting the people, I think now after 10 years, that are really, as we've seen, like in global terms, significantly poor. Next slide, please. And so one thing we see from looking at what our customers use pretty quickly is that even if you have an electricity connection, that doesn't mean that you're out of energy poverty, because if we sort of we created a benchmark of 250 kilowatt hours per month, and that's really no hot water. That's washing with a kettle quite modestly and a 2-plate stove, a bit of media, only 3 lights, and then cell phone. And that's not by any means profligate use of energy. And we find a lot of our customers using less than that. 70% of our subsidized customers using less than that, and 30% using less than 150 kilowatt hours. So there's still significant energy poverty, even though people are connected. Sorry, next slide, please. And so the problem statement that we kind of came up with the service providers was, okay, even if households have an electricity connection and this opens up access to relatively cheap energy services, appliances that you can buy, we still have energy poverty, and that's got a lot of significant consequences for well-being, around health, access to employment, safety in terms of fires, a huge problem in Cape Town. And there's a huge gap that we see between current levels of free basic electricity, and obviously we understand the fiscal constraints when we say that, and the actual basic needs of a household, a low-income household. So we've got very high electrification rates in Cape Town, but we've got, context of rapidly increasing tariffs, increased informality. We think the city will be 50% informal by 2030, continued immigration, and then quite big national electricity supply constraints currently. Next slide, please. And the central research question which the study went into is what kind of model delivers the best possible energy services, which are sustainable, affordable, both for the city and the consumers, all parties, and safe, clean, offers choice, flexibility, and supports inclusivity. Next slide, please. And the approach was a cost of supply study, which I think is a good thing for any municipality to understand its costs, a literature review, a quantification of the socioeconomic benefits of additional access. We'll just try and put numbers to less fires and better income prospects, improved health, and then, the modeling of the financial costs of the scale-up service. Next slide, please. So I can't go into many of the details here, but you'll see this for other municipalities. On the far left, that's what it costs to just keep a lifeline customer connected. So most people aren't spending anywhere near that much on their electricity, but it's costing us over 400 Rand. And you'll see that for most municipalities, some higher figures. So we're not getting a very good return on investment is one way of seeing that. Next slide, please. And again, on the far left, of that subsidy, we're getting a little bit from the equitable share grant, national grant, but most of that subsidy is being paid by the city of Cape Town, and that's hitting us with a bill of about 800 million. By way of example, the 60 kilowatt hour subsidy is costing national in the region of around 300 million. So that electricity subsidy is sitting mostly with our rates base. So next slide, please. And I can't go into these scenarios, but we looked at different ways. The base case is at the bottom, and what you can see is even if we look at things like gas cooking or solar water heaters or gas water heating, it's going to be more expensive. And I think one of the takeaways from this quite a ambitious, in the green box that we showed you, model in the spirit of the times. There's some way to make life better, but of course in finance it's a zero-sum game. To give more service costs more money, and we have less money. And I think that's really the problem we face. And being innovative around technology doesn't necessarily get us there, is one of the insights. So next slide, please. And so this is my last slide, and I'm going to ask Brian just to feed back slightly. And there were kind of a lot of recommendations, but I decided to show these 4 conditions of success. Blended public and private sector solutions, so not easy to do in our legislative framework, to be sure. But we need to mitigate this risk to current subsidization. Brian will speak to working with the private sector on gas and the difficulties and possibilities there. Behavior change and incentives. Around appliances and safety, and possibly reducing the peak impacts on our system of low-income households. And then basically, if we're going to go the alternative energy routes, and Brian again will speak briefly to that, around gas and also batteries and LEDs, and education on how to use these things, and safety is going to be very important. And then I think I feel very strongly about this is around capital equipment. So the appliances, can we make them more efficient? And also, can we find ways to make appliances cheaper or to capitalize appliances? The discount rates of low-income households are very high. We can really help them through capitalization of appliances. So let's not just think about energy costs. We need to think about appliance costs as well, and whether it's possible in collaboration with the private sector to make things cheaper. So one of the things, just in conclusion, I mean, we might not be able to help our connected customers, but we do have a significant number of households that aren't connected. And it's quite unfair. They're not connected, so they don't get this benefit of free basic electricity and subsidized electricity. They're cut out of that subsidy regime. It's one of the best things we can do. It's the most efficient form of one citizen giving to another, fiscally efficient, is to subsidize something like electricity. And so, yeah, we feel quite strongly that something like free basic gas, which kind of is supported broadly in the legislation, is at least something we can do to that very small minority that aren't electrified but growing, to make the distribution of subsidized energy services a lot more equitable. And so, yeah, I'm going to ask Brian just to briefly speak to that and something he's been looking at over the last year. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Well, hi, everyone. The city is highly electrified. It's got in excess of 90% of its households which have a grid connection. But there are certain areas where people won't ever be connected. The land is encumbered. It might be earmarked for development. Otherwise, they're illegal settlements, or they're in floodplains, or they're built on landfalls, and they just won't be electrified. And there are about 10,000 households in that circumstance, and they don't have any access to any energy subsidy. And in addition to that, we have somewhat like 26,000 people who are going to be electrified, but face a substantial delay in getting electrified, so they haven't got access to any subsidy either. Now, the department the section I'm heading at the moment, the line section, low income section, we're trying to alleviate energy poverty, and people who don't have any subsidy are really they're subject to the most energy poverty, in my opinion. And we're trying what we can to make a difference. There's a national free basic alternative energy policy, which was issued in 2003, and it encourages municipalities to make alternative energy subsidy available where there's no grid electrification. Now, in Cape Town's case, everything and all the subsidy which comes from national is mopped up and topped up in free basic electricity. So there's no money left for anything else. So we're at the moment, we exploring how the mechanisms we can make a difference. And there are two issues here. One, obviously, is to find the money, but the other side is then how do we provide the service? And we probably won't be able to find the money. I'm not saying we will be able to, but we won't even have a case if we don't know how we're going to provide the service. And so that's an area we've been exploring. One can either appoint contractors, and bearing in mind that we've got multitudinal numbers of diverse informal settlements, the idea of managing a whole lot of short-term contractors is just untenable. One won't be able to provide standardized service. Just managing the performance of multiple contractors, contractors working in those environments is very, very challenging. On top of that, many of these households are, because the land's incumbent, you can't have permanent infrastructure there. And one also wants a way to be administratively efficient in the way one goes about it. And for a whole lot of reasons, we're pursuing a way, instead of appointing contractors directly, and in the past the city has on an ad hoc basis done a little bit here and a little bit there, but that doesn't give any kind of unified long-term solution. So what we are looking at is the way to provide an alternative energy subsidy, where that subsidy can only be used for energy, but then it's put out to the markets, and then with some advice and direction from the city, the occupant of the informal household can decide where they're going to use that subsidy. For instance, they might use it to top up gas in an LPG cylinder, but they might also sign it over on a monthly basis to a solar home provider, and that could be up to the resident to choose. It looks as though there might be functionality linked to our prepayment coupon vending system, which is not used at the moment, which is linked to a so-called scratch card system, which would facilitate us providing the subsidy. Obviously, one has to make sure that there is only one subsidy issued to one household per month, and that energy has to be dispensed. You can't just have a service provider that's mopping up all the funds and not providing any service. So there have to be quite a lot of checks and balances. But I think it is eminently doable. We'll probably put out an RFI to just see what the market would offer as solutions. We believe there are solutions at the moment, but we don't want to limit them to current contracts, which the city has got. Obviously, the big one is to find the money. I think one's looking at about a 10% increase on current funding for FBE, so it's kind of doable. Just probably last comment is that we haven't included FBAE to backyarders, and that issue still has to be thought through. I think that would add a huge amount to the cost because of numbers. But yeah, backyarders at the moment do have access to electricity in most cases, although there's a lot of extortion involved. But at the moment, we're not particularly thinking of backyarders being included in the net. And just a last thought is that if we have a system implemented which is compatible with our FBE and free FBE, and this is just thinking, I've got no official support for it, but in the future it might be cheaper for the city to allow somebody to use that FBE money for LPG. Might be cheaper for the city because it reduces peak consumption when electricity is the most expensive from Eskom, because people basically use lots of electricity during peak periods. So that's where we are at the moment. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian and Adrian. Yeah, it was a good presentation indeed, and I can assure you that we've noted the problem statement, in particular the significant gap between the current levels of FBI, free basic electricity, and the actual basic energy needs. And I anticipate lots of questions and inputs around that, and also the issues around the increase in electricity tariffs, and of course increase in the in-migration, as well as national electricity system supply constraint. We have noted that. Again, the four proposals that you made, Adrian, you mentioned them as 4 conditions for success. Yeah, surely there is, those are good. However, there is, yeah, I'm sure questions around some of those ones, which we anticipate that at the end of the next presentation. Without any further ado, we're gonna go to the next item, which is basically the presentation on the application and customization of the survey model, which basically reflect on the results inside potential as well as other consideration. Basically gonna hand over to Lisbeth as well as Andrea to take us through that. Over to you, colleagues.
Yes, thank you, Silas. Could you allow me to share my screen? Or actually, I see I can now. I'll share my presentation right away, and I will be speaking first, and then Lisbeth will follow with some more information. So, good morning, everyone from my side. Thank you for joining this presentation. So what we are going to talk about is the development of a model, a simulation model, that was created with a few objectives. I list them here. First of all, we want to map and understand the complexity related to energy consumption as a starting point for the town, for Cape Town. And then the method used is a systemic approach that builds on the work that has been done before, as it was presented earlier. It aims at capturing the dynamics of change and forecasting how the context will follow different paths in the future for Cape Town. And then the approach used is co-creation, meaning that we don't have a pre-built model that we could just apply to this context, but we had several conversations to understand what is the context, how is the problem, or let's say the opportunity not being realized rather than a problem emerging. And then we have developed the model we will show soon. It is important to mention that this model was created as a tool to explore options to be further customized, personalized with new numbers and so on and so forth, rather than being a model that is already fully set up to generate precise forecasts. So it's really a model that helps asking the right questions rather than providing ultimate answers. So first, some introductions on the methodology. We use two methods. The first one is qualitative, and this is what we've used to map the system in a way. This is called systems thinking. And then the quantitative method that we use to quantify the impacts is called system dynamics. Now, these are not methodologies that we have created. They were created in the 1950s. And they are applied to a variety of problems, going from supply chain management in the private sector to sustainable development planning. Now, the same methodology was applied in South Africa for the SAGEM, the South Africa Green Economy Model, back in 2012, supported by the UN Environment Programme and the Department of Environmental Affairs, and then updated again in 2018 for the same type of assessment, also at subnational level. But there is a history of the use of this methodology in the country. In fact, there is a community of system dynamics models in South Africa, and the one I'm involved in is in Stellenbosch. Then, as a next step, why we use this methodology, I think it's important to clarify that every method and model has strengths and weaknesses, but here we use this method specifically because it allows us to connect how the way a system is set up to how it behaves. So it allows us to keep track with causal relations, the linkages between population, energy consumption, the type of energy that is being used, and then the outcomes, social, economic, and environmental, and how these outcomes then affect population and energy demand in turns. Then it allows us to simulate what-if scenarios, meaning that we can see what happens if we change the policy, rather than telling us what is the best policy to implement at any given point in time. So the model doesn't optimize, but it helps us assess what are the outcomes of our decisions. So if something suboptimal emerges, something undesirable emerges, then we can see it explicitly, we can refine our planning, and we can introduce a different type of strategy, for instance. Then potentially it allows us to look at different spatial areas, meaning that we can combine this modeling approach with a spatially explicit set of tools and maps to understand where to plan and how in the city. And then, as you will see, it integrates knowledge from different disciplines. This is the core message that comes out of the model. That is, we need to link social, economic, and environmental indicators regardless of the policy or strategy we want to analyze. Now I'll start presenting the first tool that we have used, the qualitative map that sort of maps the system. It helps us understand how it works. And you will understand very soon why we use this method. It's just to be able to keep track of why change takes place and how change may evolve in the future. So first, we started from the consideration, as you see on the left side, that there is a growth in economic performance, historical growth in economic performance that has led to the creation of employment opportunities in Cape Town, which has led to basically the growth of the economy driven by knowledge and skills, but also the volume of population that we have in the area, as compared to what has happened in neighboring areas. Now, this has led to the growth of income overall in the city, which for certain household groups has led to the increase in affordability, and which ultimately improves even more the economic growth of the city, which creates again more economic productivity, production and employment and so on and so forth. So we see here historically a reinforcing or self-reinforcing mechanism with the economy of the city growing over time. Then what we have discussed also is that as there are more employment opportunities, especially in relation to what happens in the neighboring regions, there is immigration in the city, which leads to an increase in population, which otherwise is impacted by fertility and mortality of the citizens. But this further strengthens that feedback loop that we have looked at, and the reinforcing feedback loop of growing population. Now, when we are able to forecast population in the city, then we can disaggregate the type of households that we have. If they live in informal housing that are not electrified or electrified, if it's formal housing, not yet electrified or electrified, or if these are backyarders. We are able to look at different dynamics and how population may develop into the future, or household groups may change into the future. With information on households, which are also impacted by some informal dynamics, but also illegal developments, for instance, for land invasion, we are then able to look at the extent to which we can introduce policy, and policies here are in orange, to the extent to which that can help supporting a transition between the different ways in which households are allocated in different housing types. For instance, subsidized housing can support moving households into areas that are electrified already. With this information then, we can see the consequences for the energy sector. So on the one hand, we identified the potential growth of illegal connections. If there are informal housing areas that expand that are not yet electrified, then that could affect mortality. At the same time, with electrification, we could provide better systems, better supply of energy services, so that we have more people moving in areas that are electrified, and so that reduces the risk, for instance, for having more illegal connections in the future. And then with these, we can move on to look at how energy is being consumed practically. So there is a certain demand for energy services. We look at lighting, electronic products, white appliances, space heating, water heating, and cooking. And then from here, we can determine the extent to which different types of energy is being used. So we move from energy services to type of energy being consumed. And out of this, we can start and think about how to determine an energy poverty index overall. Now, from this point, we can start assessing the externalities or the outcomes in a way of the energy use, which have to do with fire risk, for instance, from paraffin use, or the impacts of air quality or on air quality from burning fossil fuels, or the potential impact of deforestation from biomass consumption. Of course, these are not all defined as necessarily negative. I mean, we look at the potential to reduce them over time. And so to determine the extent to which they're affecting the performance of the system, we look at costs. So for instance, the societal cost of material damage or reduced air quality, or the contribution that deforestation has made in reducing invasive alien species. So the model, again, is not set up to optimize and define what's good or bad. It's just set up to forecast what happens if we change a given policy. Now, having energy consumption, we can then move on to estimate the total energy consumption across different household types and for the whole city, and then look at the cost of energy and finally link back to affordability. So we can see the extent to which dynamics in the energy sector or for energy consumption and pricing affect the performance of households, economic performance of households in the city. Now, this is where the pricing of energy comes in, with the energy price for non-electricity and the electricity price, which is of course impacted by the tariff policy, by electricity subsidies, by electrification, for instance, grid upgrades, and so on and so forth, out of which we can then determine the cost of the subsidy system. So overall, what we see in this case is that there are pros and cons for every action we implement. And again, in orange, we see the policy options, but we can see also there are some factors that may not be taken directly into account, such as the reliability of electricity supply, which may be impacted by, let's say, if you go to a renewable energy strategy, the theft of solar panels. So we have a short-term improvement in the performance and reliability, which is then followed by a medium-term or possibly even longer-term negative development. If once the panels are purchased and they're stolen, there is no money or resources to replace them. So we are trying to look at, in an objective way, all the pros and cons from a societal perspective. So building in social, economic, and environmental factors, some of which have to do also with education, capacity building. Oh, apologies, my PowerPoint has decided to crash. But I was saying that we look at also the potential to improve how the equipment is being looked after, so that efficiency in the system could potentially improve, as opposed to having the low level of efficiency that is found now in many cases across different types of households. So this, and this is presented here on the top right corner. So this is in a way what the model is set out to do. Then at this point, we carried out data collection to figure out, and you see here in the thematic areas that we are highlighting, the extent to which we have data on population, which was fairly good, or on dwellings, and so how households are allocated into different housing types, and that was also fairly good. And then on the energy consumption side, by household type and fuel source or energy source being used, to then move to social and environmental externalities, where information becomes less available, but it's mostly information that is modeled, actually, in many cases. And then we move on to energy price and expenditure to then affect affordability and economic performance. Now, this affordability and economic performance is where it gets a bit trickier, because we have data normally either at the household level from surveys concerning affordability, as we heard before, but the economic performance overall is normally for the city, where we want to affect migratory patterns and so on. So we have a model that works at different scales. So unless we do a quantification, even if very basic, and again, for testing purposes, it's difficult to tease out any specific policy messages, because there is a high degree of complexity in the model. So we can tackle it to a certain extent, but nevertheless, it's difficult. So we have then proceeded to develop this quantitative model, where we try and quantify as many as possible of the relationships that we have identified in the model. It is based, as I said, on the systematics methodology. It's customized, meaning that we haven't built a similar model before, and it runs over time from 2016 and onwards with monthly or annual time steps, so that potentially you could look at into the future the seasonal distribution or changes in energy consumption from summer months, winter months, and so on, and then also assess the medium, the short, medium, and longer term consequences of action or inaction, so keeping the same policy or changing. So I'll switch over now to the software to give you an idea of what the model looks like. I would say it's as scary as the slides you have seen before, if not more. So this is the model itself. It's built on a software that is actually very flexible. It allows us to do models for a variety of disciplines, so it's not packed to any specific topic or method. And I'll zoom in a bit more now. But I wanted to show you that it is basically following the same structure as the conceptual diagram I showed before. So we have the economic aspects here with the value added for the city of Cape Town. We have the number of households that change based on migration and internal growth. We then assign households to different settlement areas over here. We move on to demand for energy services here for lighting, for electronic products, white appliances, and so on and so forth. Then we determine the energy consumption by energy source for each energy service. And then here at the bottom on the right corner, we determine the externalities, the fire risk, for instance, potential deforestation, the use of paraffin and how it affects health costs, for instance. And then at the bottom here, moving towards the left, we have the calculation of costs with introduction of the subsidy policy that ultimately will go on to affect disposable income, and at the same time, manage affordability will determine the extent to which people can move up to other better types of settlements. Now, the model runs in no more than a second throughout the simulation. Changing a policy is actually relatively quick. If I look at the subsidy for electricity, we can modify that value for each type of households and settlement. Here we have informal, not electrified. Of course, we don't make any change to electricity subsidies for non-electrified households. But in this case, you can see for informal electrified, we have the possibility, and I'll extend a bit the timeline, we have the possibility to introduce a change in pricing. In this case, it's a simple assumption. We assume a 20% reduction as a shock introduced in the system from 2022. But of course, we can introduce different data points. We can change the trajectory. We can make it linear, non-linear. We can make it follow an S shape. So there is a possibility to end up with whatever shape you're interested in. So that is one of the factors that make this software and the model useful. I would think that everything is transparent and everything can be customized very, very easily. So as a result of these changes, then the model will run simulations to forecast basically outcomes for all the variables I indicated before, including some additional ones that we have added here on the right side that have to do with renewable energy. So as we said, there are many strategies that could be implemented. If one option to support those that are not that are living in areas that are not electrified if renewable energy were to be provided to them as solar PV or solar water heaters, then with the model, we can see what share of demand will be switched over to off-grid renewables. And so then we can calculate the amount of renewable energy capacity and related costs. So kilowatts of capacity and then related costs. Now, I know that this is a bit daunting to see. I hope you're all still there. So I'll go back to the presentation and show some of the insights that emerge from this initial rendition of the model. And again, this is a model that is used at the moment, I hope, to explore the right questions rather than to look for specific outcomes. But here are some of the results that emerge. So first of all, as indicated earlier, we confirm and we can see from the model that subsidies reduce the cost for households that already have access to electricity, not for those that are in non-electrified buildings. So for these other households, there is little advantage that comes from as a direct outcome of the policy, but there are some indirect consequences. In fact, if affordability increases, all energy consumption is bound to increase, meaning that there is what is called a rebound effect. If you reduce or if you increase efficiency in one specific area, then there is going to be a rebound effect in that we have freed up resources to invest in some other areas or to consume other products. The same here, if you reduce the cost of energy, there is the potential that increased affordability makes so that people will consume more energy also in other areas or other types of fuels. So if electricity is cheaper, maybe we forget every once in a while to turn off the light. And so that is represented here, meaning that potentially there is going to be a short-term increase in all energy use when affordability increases, not only electricity, and that may lead to a potential short-term increase in the externalities. So the risk of fires, the health impacts and pollution and so on. Now, this is particularly important for those, of course, that are impacted directly by the subsidy, that are connected to electricity. But if that leads to the overall improvement in the city, that could be a side effect that emerges across. Then a positive outcome, though, out of the same dynamics is that if affordability increases over time, so if this is sustained and the city overall performs well, then there may be a transition from informal housing to formal housing, conditional to the fact that there must be supply, of course, of informal housing and electrified, which is, understand, not to be taken for granted overall. But nevertheless, if there is this transition, what the model shows is the potential increase in the share of people living in formal electrified housing. Now, a counter effect of this, because again, as usual, there is always pros and cons for each option. If affordability increases and the city performs even better than the region, that what we are expecting is that there will be migration, rural to urban or from other areas into Cape Town, with the hope to improve the standard of living, but ultimately ending up in informal settlement, land grabbing, and so on and so forth. So while on the one hand, we may be able to improve the situation for those living in the city already, then we may generate more of an influx of people that are in need of support because of the ambition to improve their situation based on how well the city is doing. Now, we looked at also some alternative options, some of which have to do with electrification. As I said, if this is via off-grid technologies, what happens in this case is that we reduce the externalities, meaning that we substitute the use of certain fuels for clean electricity. And so that reduces the overall risk of fires, for instance, health impacts and pollution, although there are other related issues that have to do, as I said before, with potential theft of infrastructure in this case. And then energy efficiency is also an important option. We looked at the dynamics that are triggered here is on the one hand, we reduce the cost, which if it increases affordability may lead to all the side effects that we mentioned earlier. But at the same time, if this is sustained, then it effectively supports the reduction of all these costs, the social, the somewhat hidden costs that normally are not taken into account when it comes to family budgeting and overall planning. So these are sort of the same dynamics that emerge across all the scenarios. And we see the 2 or 3 macro ones that are very important. One is the effect of affordability in improving the situation for households and then in transition to electrified housing. If that doesn't happen, there are side effects that may emerge. For instance, the extra use of energy or sources at that point, or the extra performance or improvement of performance that brings more people to the city. And these two dynamics will create a lock-in, meaning that you never get out of the subsidy approach in a way. The more successful you are, the more there will be a need for that, practically. And also the externalities will not decline extensively. But if this is combined with energy efficiency and renewables, all done at the same time, of course, with all the complexity this brings, because it's not an easy process on the subsidy side, it's even less so when you add energy efficiency and renewables, then we can see the potential accumulation of benefits over time, meaning that the subsidy addresses the need here and now, but it doesn't need to cumulative change over time that improves the situation in a sustainable way. That is the potential of energy efficiency and renewable energy, especially off grid, because on top of addressing part of the short-term need, they also address in part the potential shortcomings that emerge from being successful on the subsidy side, and more importantly, they create the foundations for the longer-term accumulation of benefits that generates the structural change that is expected. So I hope that these initial insights are useful. We will have, of course, the model being made available with instructions for further use. And any comment or suggestion you may have on that would be very welcome, not of course today, but also over time. And I will pass on the word now to Lisbeth Kazier, my colleague, to give you more information on the underlying the set of models or the framework that we have used to develop this, this model in this case, which is called SAVI, Sustainable Asset Valuation, which is part of a different strand of work, but it has greatly informed the way this model has been developed. So over to you, Lisbeth.
Thank you, Andrea. Hi.
So, hi.
Go ahead.
It's Lauren interrupting you. Sorry. I was just wondering if we could, because I think that was a really informative and dense presentation, I would just like to invite everyone, if there's an urgent pressing question that you'd like to put on the table now, we could certainly do that. Maybe we can just take just a handful of questions if there are any. Otherwise, I would also just like to invite everyone to, while that is still fresh in your minds, to drop any additional questions you might have into the chat, and we will then address that here, and also just a reminder that we're going to address it in the summary note that's going to be distributed afterwards. Also, just a reminder, I've gotten a few queries about whether or not there are going to be copies of these presentations and also a copy of the recording of the webinar. Absolutely. Those are going to be distributed as well. So, are there any questions specifically for Andrea that anyone would like to put forward at this point, or shall we hold them over until Lisbeth has made her contribution as well?
So I have received a question already in the chat. I'll respond openly as we gather more questions in case, and it's when the model will be available. So we're actually finalizing now all the materials. So we're expecting to have everything ready by the end of the month, meaning that we just have to go through our final internal review, and then we'll be ready to share the materials. So it's a matter of a couple of weeks, not of months. So that will happen very soon.
Great. Mentioned, is that for electricity or energy? Okay, so there's a question here from Richard Halsey. It says that when we're talking about affordability, are we speaking for electricity or for energy more broadly? And I think this is specifically for the model, I would imagine.
Yes. Well, thank you for the question. So we have both indicators, actually. We have a sort of an index that looks at the overall energy affordability for households, taking into account all energy sources that are being consumed and relative prices or respective prices. And then at the same time for electricity. So we see the extent to which there is the potential for increasing consumption when prices change, meaning that we increase the affordability threshold. Nevertheless, we are not looking in detail at different levels of consumption. So we're not looking at whether there is more consumption being unlocked because of the extra affordability, say moving from a certain level of consumption to another bracket or another level of consumption. We just have a continuous change in the model without grouping into specific type of consumers in a way, just households, disaggregations.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it looks like at this stage there aren't any additional questions, so we'll hold over on the Q&A until the end and hand over to Lisbeth. Lisbeth, thank you very much, and thank you for graciously allowing me to interrupt you.
No, of course, thank you, Lauren, and hello to everyone. I certainly realize that it's a full package of information we're providing you with the PowerPoint. So really, if you have any questions also throughout that's come up now, feel free to put them in the chat directly. And basically what I want to do in the next couple of minutes, and I won't take long, is to take a step back and explain a little bit more of the background of why and how we came about developing the SAVI methodology, the Sustainable Asset Valuation methodology, which forms the baseline of the work that Andrea just explained to you. And at IISD, at the infrastructure program, for a long time, when working with governments as well as with the private sector, we've seen repeatedly that there are certain risks as well as externalities that are overlooked or not integrated into traditional analysis, traditional cost-benefit analysis, and in investment decision making. And the reason for which we started to develop SAVI was really that. How do we better integrate, how do we better quantify environmental, social, governance risks, climate risks, and other externalities, benefits, positive and negative externalities that infrastructure projects can bring for governments, for citizens, as well as for investors. And so on the next slide, you'll see that the SAVI methodology is really a combination of that systems thinking that Andrea explained earlier, the qualitative side, the tools of the causal loop diagrams, as well as system dynamics models, as well as project finance models, to be able to provide an integrated assessment and also a comparison of different infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. So the three characteristics, if you wish, or features of the methodology is, on the one hand, that we're simulating different scenarios, looking at different kind of comparisons of projects, of technologies, looking in the energy sphere, for example, what's the comparison between fossil fuel generated electricity and renewable energy? And how can we place a financial value on some of the risks and externalities that some of the avoided costs and added benefits that those projects bring? In addition to that, since the last 12 months now, we're increasingly working with climate data from the Copernicus Climate Data Store to better integrate climate risk into the projects that we are assessing. And this can range from specific infrastructure projects as well as infrastructure portfolios, where we're going to have a much more accurate and much better estimate on what's the result of including changes in temperature, changes in precipitation on a very specific location, and what's their impact on the performance, the financial performance of projects. And a last point or last characteristics of the methodology is that we really customize the model, either to individual projects or to individual policies, as well as to the local context, as Andrea has also showed you in his presentation before. And to just give you a snapshot of the climate risks, which are increasingly important nowadays in the assessment of our projects, and what does that mean in terms of financial impact, I just would like to show you a snapshot of a tool that we've been developing with the Copernicus Climate Data Store, where, and this is also access that we can provide you with, where you can see and start to simulate what's the impact in the location of, I put Cape Town here as we're looking at the Cape Town assessment today. What's the temperature change going to look like under a high emission intensive scenario, under a climate scenario, the RCP 8.5 that you see there, over the next 80 years. And it's that kind of data that you see there that we are now increasingly integrating into the SAVI model to better estimate the climate risks of projects. And a second feature of this application, and this is freely available online. On the next slide, you'll see that we're also generating some maps that are location specific, where you can see what under a high emission intensive scenario, what the temperature change will look like over time, which is the future change that you see on the map on the right. And in the interest of time, Andrea, you can skip the next 2 slides. And what I'll do is just jump to another application in the sphere of energy, where we have applied the SAVI model. And this is on an energy project in Senegal, where we've compared the first large-scale wind farm in Senegal with other energy technologies. So the heavy fuel oil and coal power plants, where we've also included a climate risk assessment. So what does climate change mean for the financial performance of the different energy technologies? And we've also included evaluation of different externalities. Here you see some of the externalities we've assessed in this project. And the reason why I'm showing you this on screen is, depending on the type of projects we'll be looking at with the SAVI methodology, we really co-create the model. So we have a discussion with stakeholders, which in this case was the planning ministry in Senegal that was responsible for the implementation and the planning of the infrastructure projects, who told us that those are the key externalities around this project that have been part of the key discussions there. So what we did is to quantify and to integrate those into the final integrated cost-benefit analysis that we produced, and that you'll see on the next slides. So this, while this looks as a very long table, actually the only points I would like you to focus on just now is just that at the end of the table, you'll see what we calculated here with the SAVI model is the levelized cost of electricity per megawatt hour. And the key points here is to see that when we include climate risks, when we include the externalities, and when we then compare the different energy technologies, we see that there is a very good investment case to make for wind energy in comparison with coal and in comparison with the HFO-fired electricity generation. So this is just one snapshot of another application of the methodology of the model, customized for specific countries, customized for a specific project that we wanted to show you to perhaps include into the discussion. Some of the other parameters, indicators that we generated through that assessment is also that we've looked at employment specifically. Employment, here the comparison for renewables versus coal was an important indicator for the government in Senegal to look at, where we also saw a very positive employment factor for the wind farm versus the other 2 technologies, as well as some of the life cycle emissions of the projects, something that we generated. And then finally, a last piece of indicators that we generated were also the internal rates of return, the net present value under these different scenarios. So comparing traditional analysis with what if we incorporate some of those climate risks into the different technologies? What are then the internal rates of return? What are the net present value? And what do those become if we also include positive and negative externalities related to the different technologies? I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope that generated also some more questions for the discussion. Of course, if you have any other questions, you can always contact myself or Andrea, and we'll definitely leave and circulate the slide deck for you as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lisbeth. Another dense and informative presentation, so thank you very much. Silas, I would like to invite you to lead us in the Q&A session now.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Yeah, and also the 2 speakers, Lisbeth, yeah, and the Andrea. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna open it up for questions, comments, inputs. Yeah, so you can either ask, raise hand, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask, or you can use the chat, yeah, the chat box. Also, maybe while ladies and gentlemen are still still preparing for asking questions, Lisbeth, you perhaps are aware of the energy landscape in South Africa, that our projection is that by 2030, the solar and wind growth will be around 33% contribution to the total electricity generation in the country. And you also indicated, you made projection in your model of the climate change increase in temperature between 2000 until 2021 or so. But I would like to pick up your brain around the issues of the impact on the renewable energy technologies, such as solar. You gave reference to wind, which I appreciate that. But in terms of solar photovoltaic, around issues of LOEC, what is your comment there? What is your input on that one?
On in relation to the South African context specifically? Because then
Yes.
I may have to hand over to Andrea there, who knows the context much better than I do. We have been looking actually at sorry, I haven't. Okay.
Yeah, you can carry on.
Okay, so your question is in relation to South Africa and the potential for solar capacity generation. So we have one savvy assessment done a while ago where we have made a comparison with solar, coal, as well as gas-fired electricity, where I think, Andrea, if I'm not mistaken, the key result was that in terms of costs, we definitely see a very good business case for solar in South Africa as well today. I don't have the exact numbers here, but happy to circulate some material on that as well.
That's
Okay.
I can confirm. No, go ahead.
Perhaps before, yes, while you're answering that, can you also questions around the issue of one of the main results from your study? One of the options which you did indicate, which is basically was one of the findings for my studies, was the issues of off-grid electrification or off-grid renewable energy technologies as one of the alternatives, especially in areas where the topography or the terrain is not favorable for the grid extension. So if you can also comment around areas across the country where you will recommend that as an option insofar as this electrification backlog and challenges are concerned. Thank you.
Silas, I just want to also flag that Adrian has a question as well. So I don't know if you want to add Adrian's question now or have the question answered and then move on.
Adrian, you can ask now so that Andrea can answer three of them at the same time.
Thanks, Silas. Just a question of clarity, just very interested in the risks that you showed. Jay, the specifically for Cape Town. So just wanted to clarify, so when you quantify the externalities, it sounds like you're not using a generalized risk cost. It sounds like it's specific to, sorry, Lisbeth. It sounds like it's specific to the location. So you're calculating the specific risk costs, unless I'm misunderstood. So I was just very interested in that aspect of what you showed. Thank you.
Okay, Andrea.
Thank you. Yes, so I'll start answering, and then Lisbeth, you can confirm on the last question. So from my side, the approach to be used to determine the potential for off-grid and renewables can change depending on the field you work in. So from a systems engineering perspective, you would just look at the total levelized cost of delivery of the energy that is needed, including the system, like the extension or the upgrade of the grid. Now, the extension of the grid is something, or the cost for the extension of the grid is something that you can save if you work with off-grid technologies. But at the same time, you need to upgrade the grid if you introduce renewables to an existing system. And possibly you have to create a custom dedicated mini grid for the off-grid systems that you may introduce in remote areas. So on the one hand, it's a matter of cost. On the other hand, there are a variety of different considerations to make on the timing, the speed in which the investment can be made. As we looked at the fact of subsidies in this case, Just waiting for electrification to come, waiting for more housing, the options that are electrified to come, implies that every year the subsidy is being paid. And if the process of expanding that infrastructure takes time and a lot more than expected, implies that costs will be accumulating every year. With an impact that may be less than what was hoped for. So on the one hand, you can start with engineering approach and look at solar radiation, look at wind speed in different parts of the countries to maximize the potential output. But on the other hand, there are all these additional considerations that are more of an implementation nature and then is political planning nature. And the context in South Africa is very complex. Maybe I scratched the surface. I know a little bit. It's already sounding very, very complex to me. For you, it's probably even more so, especially considering the leadership role of ESCOM and the type of outcomes that we have obtained from the studies that we have done on power generation. As Lisbeth said, in these cases, what we looked at was the fact of the creation or the extent to which the creation of a dedicated mine for power generation was providing coal at low cost. And even in that case, having coal at low cost coming straight from the mine for that specific power generation project was not leading to a massively more economically viable project overall, or levelized cost of electricity generation. If anything, even when we don't have all the societal outcomes built in, and again, these are customized and prepared at a local level, then coal would lose its edge. Even without considering, on top of what I said before, the fact that trade dynamics may be impacted. The EU, maybe other countries will be introducing something along the lines of the carbon border adjustment that the European Green Deal includes, which will affect all trade dynamics with the European Union, highlighting the potential risk just for this, but also other country policy to generate stranded assets in the country, or to generate assets that will lead to accumulated costs again, and so much less profitability than what is expected. Which is why then we build on top of the system dynamics model, the project finance model, because again, different approaches for different audiences. If we talk to a planner, we can use tools like the ones we have shown today. If we talk to an investor or a bank or a central bank, we have to use a project finance model. Now that is what they use, and we have to align with their expectations. So a long answer. I hope it was somewhat clear and provided some inputs, but unfortunately we cannot point to this specific part of the country could profit from that type of technology or approach. But the underlying rationale is the same, I think, and applies across. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. Mr. Jones, you did indicate that yes, your office is responsible for alleviating energy poverty in the city of Cape Town, which I think the issue of migration to metros is common to all metros in South Africa for obvious reasons, which are economic and business opportunities. You know, and unfortunately, I do not see how you're going to stop that migration, and yeah, pressure will keep on mounting with time. As I said, it's a common problem to all metros. What is your projection in the next 10, 15 years, and how do you foresee handling the challenge there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and I'll just share it with you. On a more short-term scale, obviously one doesn't want to encourage illegal land invasions. The city on a sort of broader approach is developing a provision of services to poor communities and informal communities. And obviously anything that we do regarding energy would have to fit into that policy. Very difficult to project what inflow is going to be in the future. Obviously, we want to be able to quantify what sort of subsidy we required. And so far, we haven't been able to, from the vast amount of resource which the city of Cape Town has, I haven't been able to pin down a growth figure. So I'm afraid I have to just ask the question with you at this stage. But obviously, it is an issue, and it's a big issue, particularly with declining revenues from the electricity utilities. You know, it's although FB is not primarily subsidized by electricity income. It comes through rates and through national government grant. So it's going to be a tough call. One, just as an aside, I think an important issue is that people need to use the energy which they have efficiently, so to make existing subsidies go further. And there are various aspects there. You know, there are pots with heat radiators on the bottom, which are for gas use, which are 30% more efficient than a flat bottom pot. So you can make your LPG go 30% further. That's quite substantial. So there is room for existing subsidies and for the future to make the money go further. Thanks.
Okay, no, thank you. Lauren, do you have a question?
Yes. So my question, I think, is probably addressed at Liesbeth, but also Andrea. So this exercise, the modelling exercise, has been undertaken for the city of Cape Town. We know the city of Cape Town is not typical of all the municipalities in the country in terms of the level of the revenues collected, for example, as well as the profile of energy users. So I was hoping that you could perhaps reflect on the broader applicability of this modelling exercise and the publication, as you mentioned, that will be shared towards the end of the month for the other metros, but also more broadly for other municipalities that also act as electricity distributors in the country. And then, Louise, do you want to add your question now? I see your hand's just gone up.
I can. It's actually a question for Silas. I was just wondering, Brian raised that the role of the private sector to address this issue of energy access, whether it's through the provision of liquid gas or renewable energy technologies. And I was just wondering to what extent that is on the radar of SAGA to take forward as a potential intervention where they can support municipalities. And of course, if it's a collective endeavor, then there will of course be cost benefits that can accrue to universities, to municipalities with a larger scale procurement around those technologies. So I was just wondering whether SAGA has actually been thinking about that, because I think it's potentially very interesting work to take forward. And I mean, I've done lots of work with Liesbeth in the past on procurement, but clearly if there's a central procurement drive, there can only be lots of efficiencies and cost benefits. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Louise. And then Richard, could we perhaps add your question as well, and then we'll hand over to Liesbeth, Andrea, and Silas. Richard?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Thanks very much. This is Richard from Project 90 by 2030. Just a sort of general question, not aimed at anyone in specific, but just talking about, affordability. We've heard the sort of figures that in City of Cape Town and Western Cape, the electrification rate is sort of maybe 96%, but energy poverty is maybe 16 to 20%, depending on which metrics you look at. So although there is a definite issue of getting electricity to more people, a large part of the problem seems to be that people just can't afford enough per month, even when they do have connection. And there's lots of ideas for where subsidies could come from and all this modeling, but under these post sort of COVID circumstances, I mean, realistically, how do we actually implement any of these measures that can allow low-income and vulnerable households to use more electricity than they currently are? Just if there's any sort of thoughts on the practical side of the outcomes of all these modeling and subsidy ideas. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Can I hand over to Liesbeth and Andrea, and then to Silas onto the thorny issue of government procurement. So Lisbeth, Andrea?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. So Lauren, on the applicability and I think the replicability of these sorts of exercise for other municipalities, that is certainly feasible, as Andrea mentioned, and I'll let him comment on that. The model is very flexible. So we've, in this case, co-created it with the city of Cape Town, but I do think it already provides a very interesting blueprint for other municipalities, and it's very easy to change assumptions in the model to leave out certain parameters that are not of relevance for another municipality, or to add certain others that are more important to them. So I certainly think both the process as well as the model that we have now can serve the needs for knowledge creation and integration for other municipalities, certainly.
Yes, if I may add, I would say there are two aspects to consider here, potential upside factors to consider. One is, yes, it is easy to adapt the model, both numbers, of course, replace the numbers and adapt the equations and variables. The other one is the potential to use the different models in conjunction with one another, especially in the region. Meaning that we looked at Cape Town with this model, but we see that migration is also being impacted by the relative performance of the city of Cape Town in relation to surrounding areas. So if a similar model, maybe more extended on the economic or social side, is being used to support similar planning at city level or regional level, then we might see how a more aligned development across different parts of the region may actually ease the burden on the city of Cape Town when it comes to managing the immigration and the need for energy access, for instance. Meaning that we can work at optimizing the situation for the city, but if there is a constant influx of people over the next years up to 2030 and beyond, then the scale of the challenge will remain the same, if not increase, right, even if you're successful. So there is that aspect to consider. And then briefly on the question on affordability, what we are leaning towards with this model that, as Lisbeth has shown we have done with other asset-related analysis, is to create a cost-benefit analysis that in this case could be for different household groups. When we would say, what are the foreseeable, tangible costs, and what are the sort of uncertain, unforeseeable costs that are normally considered to be soft costs, but that in the end affect the population. So the cost of fires, the cost to health, for instance, the unexpected cost of energy use if, say, the price of paraffin changes and so on and so forth. So if you're able to figure out what would be, together with a household survey possibly, what would be an inclusive cost-benefit analysis or self-sufficiency type of assessment for different household groups, then we may be able to explain a bit more the differences between the electrification rate and the energy affordability index or estimate. Just for the fact that there are many factors that may be intangible that prevent people from going the extra step and deciding to or being able to move to electrified housing or make use of the opportunity that the subsidy may bring, and so increase consumption without keeping it at bare minimum, for instance. So that's sort of a potential new development that we could look into, and that concept of affordability or integrated cost-benefit analysis at household level, again, self-sufficiency standard of sorts, could be applied in other cities, other municipalities as well. To see how different social, economic, and environmental conditions actually affect behavior in different parts of the country. I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. Silas, would you like to respond to the question on public-private collaborations to address energy poverty and the possibility of SALGA perhaps creating leading work to allow for an integrated approach to solving the procurement barriers and challenges that might prevent this kind of strategy?
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think Nhlanhla wanted to take this. However, before maybe he comes in, I wanted to indicate that yes, We have heard that question several times in different platforms, Louise. The last one was Women in Energy, somewhere in August or September, where, yes, the question came through about, firstly, our support as SALGA about the LPG first, as compared to electricity or source of energy to supplement electricity. And we made it clear that as SALGA, LPG is one of the energy sources which is sustainable and which we do support that. But the issues around collaboration with the private sector, it did came in, and we have made it clear that we do support sustainable form of energy for municipalities as SALGA. But in terms of remember, we do this on behalf of municipalities. Municipalities are autonomous. They do have their own procurement processes that they follow. They do have their own IDPs and list of projects that they intend to embark on. But what we did indicate that is we do support that, and where there is a need, we do engage a particular municipality and make presentation in terms of the sustainable source of energy, which LPG is basically one of them. But maybe, Shasha, do you want to come in and add?
No, I think, Salas, you covered it to some extent. I just wanted to touch base on the public-private partnerships question. I think for the other parts, I think you've got it covered. Thanks, and good day, everyone. I think on the public-private partnerships, it goes without saying, SALGA is in support of that. There is a framework already at National Treasury that allows municipalities to do that. But I think although there is an enabling environment, we still don't have the base cases, what we can learn from. I think we are only starting now to have, one or two municipalities engaging on the public-private partnership setup, but we haven't seen it being in operation. It's currently underway. I think once you start having base cases about how PPPs are working on the energy space, especially in relation to local government or municipalities, I think we'll start understanding what exactly do we need to assist municipalities with? What are the shortcomings for municipalities to get into the space of public-private partnerships? But I think my affirmation was that the municipalities, nothing is stopping them to enter into triple Ps. There is a framework. Even private sector can also, as Silas has said, municipalities are autonomous entities. Private sector is more than welcome to, knock into the doors of municipalities, propose some solutions and some legal frameworks that might make it work both for the private sector and the municipalities, or especially on the electrification space. We haven't seen it. I think the PPPs that we've seen are mostly on the O&M side of things, where a private sector was contracted for like 5 to 10 years by a municipality to do maintenance on and operate the infrastructure. But on the new infrastructure, the rolling out of the new infrastructure and the installation of the new infrastructure, I don't think we have seen that. That's why I'm just hoping that as time goes, we're going to have a lot of base cases. Right now, we have Midval who are in the final stages of getting into a triple P kind of setup on the energy space. So I think that's going to be helping us a lot in terms of sharing the knowledge around what has been their challenges, what are the successes, and what can other peers in municipalities learn from the triple P setup in Midval. I think I've said the mouthful. Thank you, Salas, and thanks, Lauren.
Okay, thank you, Shasha. Colleagues, do we still have any question? But if you do, you can write on the chat box. So I'm going to hand it over to Lauren. Thanks. Over to you, Lauren.
Great. Thank you, Silas. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nhlanhla, for that clarity. I think absolutely the challenge now as municipalities have to navigate this complex socio-technical transition in the energy space, and indeed more broadly for all the interconnected infrastructure systems at the municipal scale, it is absolutely imperative that we have shared learning and sense-making spaces facilitated as well. And so that certainly is what this series of webinars is about. We will be continuing with this series next year. One of the topics we hope to address early on in the year is around wheeling and the facilitation of the wheeling of renewable energy within municipal boundaries. But there's plenty more. So I would love to extend an invitation at this point to everyone to say, please reach out to us if there are topics that you would like to collaborate around, if there are particular questions and issues that you think are really pertinent and have to be addressed, do let us know. As part of this series, we also will be looking at publishing very soon a range of policy briefs, concept notes, and case studies that also support sense-making for just transition at a local scale in South Africa. So with that, again, please reach out if you have any comments, questions, or concerns. Other than that, I would like to extend my thanks to our presenters for today, to Adrian and to Brian from the city. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and deep experience with us. To Lisbeth and Andrea, thank you as well. And we hope to collaborate with you going on into next year. Thank you, Louise, for facilitating all of this and making this, this webinar possible. And to my colleagues at Salga, of course, for being so open to collaboration and for really leading the charge, surfacing the challenges and opportunities and risks that face our municipal governments and the people that they serve as well in this process of transition within the energy sector. So thank you very much. And Silas, are there any final remarks from you, or Nhlanhla also anything from you? But other than that, I would like to say thank you very much to everybody, and have a great day further and a safe festive season as well.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. I'm gonna hand it over to Nhlanhla, but before that, just wanted to indicate that there were some delegates that were unable to register, which I then forwarded them my link. Hence, my name is appearing several times. Can those delegates make sure that they do write their names and email addresses on the chat box so that we can send them the presentation afterwards? Thank you. Over to you, Nhlanhla.
Thanks, Silas. Thanks, Lauren. You know, Lauren, Silas is slave driving me. He wants to talk. He wants me to talk even when it's not necessary. But I would like to just thank you, Lauren. Thank you to the presenters, the partners. I think I'm going to say this again. I've said this before. I think for Salga and municipalities going forward, private sector is going to be playing a very critical, part of the energy transition and the just transition in municipalities. So it goes without saying that we need to work very close to private sector. They're going to be the biggest part of the energy transition. And as Salga representing municipalities, we are here to support the facilitation of that, to ensure that it happens in a manner that is fair for municipalities and in a manner that is actually successful as well. So I think even the municipalities themselves understand, the criticality around the future of the their energy landscape. That it cannot really continue them in the manner that it's been happening. Almost 100 years ago, our system in South Africa, it's actually an old white elephant, and it's obvious that we need to change. We need to move into a future, move into a space where we are not monopolies anymore. We have to just let go of those powers. It's not doing good for any of us. It's obvious that we have to work with these partnerships, work with private sector, work with young people, people who are innovative to take us forward as local government. I would like to thank everyone, the partners who made this webinar possible. I think this is going to be assisting a lot. This online and virtual meeting is going to be assisting a lot in actually even the learnings for us as well, because it's make it easier, you know, because you don't have to drive up and down the meetings and having to fly to Cape Town or to wherever to try and attend the webinar. So I'm quite excited about what this new normal is presenting for us. It's actually bringing those opportunities even for municipalities to learn more. So I'm really thankful, colleagues. And if we don't meet from now, please go and be safe, practice social distancing, mask, for beverages, make sure you do it responsibly. Curfew is 12 o'clock, except for PE, which is, I think it's 10 p.m. So colleagues, please go and enjoy your Christmas, your holidays. Those who are traveling, please be safe. Thank you very much. Bless you.
Thank you, Nhlanhla. Can we remain, Nhlanhla, with Lauren and the presenters behind for a few minutes? Thank you.
Of course, thank you all.